respond. Thank you, Karen. Struggling through a few harsh words there. I told you we should all learn Hebrew. It'd be a lot of fun. Number one, first thing I want to say is we had a little party last week. Yeah, there you go, Sammy. Some of you were there. A lot of, I know it's everybody's tired now. They're like, oh my gosh. But I want to thank everybody who was there and everybody especially that was part of planning it, part of helping out with getting everything going, because it was really amazing. It was a day that I'll never forget in my life. So I think you should all, for each other, especially, well, I couldn't name everybody because it's like everybody that went into planning that. It was pretty amazing. So thank you for that. And I want to say, I've got something up here. We have a little quote I want to start off with. I don't know if you have that, Matt. But this is by Rachel Held Evans, which is an author. And she said, I have come to regard with some suspicion those who claim that the Bible never troubles them. I can only assume this means they haven't actually read it. Today's scriptures might kind of lead there too. Right? There are a lot of parts of the Bible you read and you're like, huh? Like, really? And this is one of those. And the reason I kind of deviated from the lectionary today to make sure you saw two of these stories about Hagar, because one of them was in the lectionary, but the other one wasn't. I wanted you to see Hagar's whole story. So let's just give a little synopsis of the story and maybe even talk about some of the problems with the text. Last week, we talked about how God gave a promise to Abraham, and then who was then called Abram, or Abram, actually, and back in chapter 12, and to make a great nation out of his ancestors, or out of his descendants, excuse me. And Abraham is bewildered by this promise because at the time, he was 75 years old. And he and Sarah, who then was called Sarai, as you read today, were unable to have children thus far. Sarah was past menopausal age and shouldn't have been able to have kids. And this is Abraham's and Sarah's kind of existential crisis that they have in their lives here. See, overpopulation wasn't the same problem back then that it is today. Having kids was considered really important for survival in a rural, sparse land, for passing on your inheritance. So Sarah and Abraham were kind of distraught by this. And they were given hope by God in God's promise. But the promise, unfortunately, does not materialize quickly. So Abraham was 75 when he was given the promise. He was 100 years old by the time that Isaac was actually born. Quarter century. That's quite an achievement. Sarah, the bigger achievement, was apparently 90. Called the Guinness Book of World Records, right? But remember that lifespans are often remembered to be much different than in modern days. People lived longer in these Old Testament stories. But this was apparently still impossible, even given they're considered the mythicized kind of lifespans that people were often given. So it is a call for excitement. Abraham is held up in the biblical tradition as someone who had great unwavering faith. And that's one of the reasons he's made into the patriarch of the Hebrews by God. But when we read Genesis carefully, we realize that his faith apparently had some moments of wavering after all. He and Sarah doubted God's promise quite a bit. And at one point during this 25 years of waiting for God's promise of a child, Sarah and Abraham take matters into their own hands. Sarah has a slave. That's one problem for our modern ears to hear. We don't like to hear that. We cringe a little bit when we hear the Bible talking about slavery without outright condemning it. But those were the times. In that culture, at that time, and throughout most of history, slavery has been a thing. But here we have it. So Sarah says to Abraham, hey, Why don't I just give you my slave, and she could be your wife, and maybe she could become pregnant and give you an heir. So obviously she was a lot younger than Abraham and Sarah. So now not only are their feelings about slavery being very different than ours, so is their concept of marriage. We see that obviously we have polygamy here. Abraham already had a wife named Sarah, and now he is going to take a second wife who is a slave. Another point to make about how different the spousal contract was back then is that Hebrew doesn't really even have a word for wife. It's just woman. Isha. Mariah, you know you're my woman? Abraham took a woman. Isha. There isn't really a word for husband and wife. It's just Ish and Isha. There's some other words thrown around there, but that's commonly what you'd see. Abraham took Hagar as his woman. It's just how they spoke, but it's probably a little telling about how the culture viewed marriage a little differently than we do today, right? How about this problem that Hagar was a slave and was wed to Abraham for the purpose of having a son? Do you think she had any say-so in this arrangement? Not that women had much say-so in those arrangements anyway, already at this point, but she was a slave, so she certainly did not have the freedom to disagree. Today, we would call this human trafficking. Hagar should be a client of the Volusia Rape Crisis Center that's moving into our center next week. It's moving into Community Hall. Hagar eventually does have a son named Ishmael. Yay! Except Sarah then has second thoughts about this whole thing. She gets upset by Hagar and Ishmael's presence, and she starts treating them badly. Doesn't say specifically what, but our imaginations can run wild with that. How does Abraham feel about all this strife? Does he protect his newer, younger wife? Which in this culture, that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to protect your wife. No. He tells Sarah, hey, she's your slave. Do with her as you please. Abraham doesn't really look so good in this story so far, right? So Hagar, with Ishmael in tow, runs away. And good for her. She runs away. But God sends an angel who convinces her to return to Sarah and Abraham. Here's another problem with the story. God sent Hagar, a slave, back to an abusive situation that she was living in. That is not the kind of advice that we give people who are being abused today, is it? But as part of this deal for her to return, God makes a promise through the angel that God will make it all up to her through Ishmael's descendants. The Lord has given heed to your affliction, the angel says. He shall be a wild ass of a man, and God will greatly multiply his offspring. Any of you ever been pregnant? How would you feel about someone telling you, hey, your kid's going to be a real ass? Right? You ever punched an angel in the face? Now, the word probably refers to an onager, which is a wild donkey that lived in the area. It's probably actually not meant as an insult. I looked at some other places where the word is used in the Old Testament. It probably actually just meant that he was going to be strongly independent, wandering, right? And getting into fights with people. And the people that came to be known as the Ishmaelites were Bedouin nomads. So, this is their origin story. This is the origin story. Later, after Isaac is finally born, Sarah becomes angry again when she sees Ishmael playing with Isaac, and she wants to cast Hagar and Ishmael out of their household. Abraham has a little more compassion this time. It says he's distressed by this, but God reassures Abraham this time and allows it to happen, apparently taking Hagar under divine protection. perhaps because she wasn't getting the protection as a wife as she should have, still being treated like a slave. When she is convinced that her and Ishmael are going to die in the wilderness, she puts him under a bush and she leaves him there, goes a distance away because she can't bear the thought of watching him die of thirst. God sends another angel who tells her not to be afraid, and again says that God will make a great nation out of Ishmael. And then God miraculously creates a well so that they can drink. So there are a lot of problems with this story here. Slavery, a woman very much getting used and abused, traumatized, cast out of her home, baby name calling, right? There's lots of stuff here. Some of these problems are anachronistic, okay? They're problems to us today, but at that time in that culture, they were kind of commonplace. It doesn't make them right, but it does explain why they're there. It does explain their presence. Ancient people wouldn't have seen these things as horribly problematic as we do today. However, despite that, Hagar is clearly cast as a victim. And this story is here because God wants us to see the injustice in Hagar's story, despite the fact that some of these things were fairly well accepted in ancient times. God didn't want any of this to happen. God asked Abraham to have faith in the promise that he and Sarah will have a son of their own, but they got impatient. And they suffered this great injustice toward Hagar. Here's something interesting, though. The promises given to Hagar are almost exactly the same as the promises given to Abraham. God will multiply Ishmael's offspring and make of him a great nation. The slave woman's inheritance will also be great. In our minds, that wouldn't really make up for all of this. But in the mind of ancient people in this culture, what happens to your descendants is paramount. We don't think about that as much today in kind of an individualistic culture. We do think about our kids, but we don't think about 6 generations from now, generally. They did. This was a big deal to her. It was the bane of Abraham and Sarah, this problem of inheritance, but it will not be a problem for Hagar and Ishmael. Even in the story that we have throughout the Hebrew Bible is the story of the Israelites, the story of Abraham's descendants. That is not the only story. Do you think God abandoned all the rest of the world? All the other peoples of the world? No. God hears them too. Here in the U.S., as we contemplate Independence Day next week, we should remember that even though we are sometimes led to believe that we are like the chosen people of God here in the U.S., that we have special favor, we should remember that all other nations and peoples are also blessed too. They're not inferior, they are blessed. Ours is a God of all creation, of all peoples everywhere, and we should recognize and celebrate the image of God in everyone, as well as in our own. God saw Hagar. God heard Ishmael's cries while he was laying under that bush. In fact, that name Ishmael means God hears, or God will hear. Ishma is from the word Shema, which means hear, and El means God, Ishmael. Hearing and seeing are loaded words in Hebrew. They mean more than just being 2 of our 5 senses. They mean more than just what you do with your eyes and your ears. They mean to know. God knows Hagar and her son. God knows them intimately, and they are not forgotten. Even though they have been treated unjustly, God will make justice for their offspring, for their future. God knows those who have been cast out. That's a lesson for our time. a time when we draw a lot of boundaries around people. We draw a lot of lines. Those who are between those who are like us and those who are not like us. The others that we create by villainizing those who we don't like, or who don't like us, or who don't look like us, don't act like us. Whoever we put on the other side of that fence from us is also loved by God, just like Hagar and Ishmael. No matter what we do, no matter how evil we think that other person is, God still hears them and sees them, knows them intimately. As a Facebook post I saw recently said, Jesus died for the addict as he did for the preacher. And to expand on that theme, Jesus died for the Republicans just as he died for the Democrat. For the criminal, just as he died for the saint. For the dark-colored person, as for the light-colored person. For the straight, as for the gay. As the man, as for the woman. As for the non-gender conforming. And as for the American, as for the immigrant. As for the homeless person, as for the rich. In short, stop drawing lines that God can't see. All the lines we draw between each other are just invisible ink. God can't see them. God sees people. And God is only on the side of justice and can't tell the difference between our political parties or what news station we watch or the color of our skin. Did you notice Hagar's nationality? Egyptian. The Israelites, hearing the story, would have recognized that. Because who enslaved them? The Egyptians. And this story, even though it takes place before that, was written probably after that, right? It was written after the being enslaved in Exodus. And they would have noticed this. They would have seen it. They were the people that, the Egyptians were the people that enslaved and oppressed the Hebrews. This is not an accident. It's an intentional flip of the script, showing us that God is fierce about maintaining issues of justice. He loves all people, even Egyptians and Hebrews, ancient enemies. This text should kind of bother us today, the way that, from a modern standpoint. And we should respond from that place of discomfort by recognizing that the other in our lives, those we separate ourselves from or cast out of society or just somehow classify as lesser people than us, they are all heard by God. While we are busy choking on our own hate of each other, God is busy blessing both sides. Love boldly, erase lines in the sand, and fight fiercely for issues of justice instead of fighting against each other. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, and bless those for whom you would not normally sit at the same lunch table with, because God hears them, and that's enough. Amen.